Good afternoon, everyone. Just going to give it a minute and wait for participants to be able to join today's webinar. Welcome to NCVER's webinar on using data to deepen our understanding of vet students and their outcomes. I'm Melinda from NCVER, and I'll be presenting today's webinar with my colleague, Michelle Hall. We're using Zoom for today's webinar platform. If you look to the bottom of your screen, you will see a black bar with some icons. You can click on audio settings on the far left of your screen to check your audio is working and set the volume to a comfortable level. All participant microphones are muted. To ask a question, please click on the Q&A icon. Only presenters will be able to see any questions asked. Before we begin, we'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land upon which we are meeting today and pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. The outline of today's webinar is broken up into three parts, the first of which covers how longitudinal student analysis has been used by NCVER to explore apprentice and trainee and vet student pathways and outcomes. I will then talk about how to use the AVS person-level integrated data asset, also known as PLIDA and formerly known as MADIP, to investigate occupation and employment outcomes for vet students. We will also share NCVER's experience in using PLIDA to assess sustainable employment outcomes for Indigenous vet students. And in the final section of the webinar, we will take you through how NCVER has developed an advanced analytics platform and techniques to explore vet data more generally. We will ensure there is plenty of time for questions and interaction at the end of the session, so please send through your questions and comments in the Q&A. I will now hand over to Michelle to talk about longitudinal student data analysis.
Thank you, Melinda. This first section looks at how we can map out training pathways within vet. And we'll start by looking at student pathways between enrolments in different instances of training in vet. We will go on to talk more specifically about apprentice and trainee pathways a little bit later in the session. So I'm going to start by taking you through some of the complexities of the data wrangling that needs to take place to allow for longitudinal analysis within vet. And then we'll go over a case study analysis to highlight the types of insights that we can gain from this approach. So to look at student pathways, we're drawing on total vet activity data, or TVA data. TVA data is collected and collated annually, and it includes information about enrolments as well as completions for all nationally recognised training. So the illustration on the slide shows activity from 2016 up to 2021, but we could also extend that out to the latest available data, which is currently 2023 activity. The TVA collection includes data on vet qualifications, as well as accredited courses and skill sets. And it also includes data on standalone subject enrolments. So those are subjects where a student undertakes a unit of competency or a module, but it's not delivered as part of a nationally recognised program. The unit or the module is just delivered on its own. So that's included in the collection as well. The collection includes activity delivered by all registered training organisations. So that includes fee-for-service activity as well as government-funded activity. And as I mentioned, Melinda will talk in detail about apprentice and trainee pathways in a little while, but it's worth noting here that this TVA data collection does include records where the activity was undertaken by apprentices and trainees. It just doesn't include detail about their contracts of training that they have with their employer. So that detailed information about the employment contract sits in the apprentice and trainee data collection. Okay, so if we want to examine student pathways between instances of training, What we need to do is to pull together training records for individual students, trace their transitions over time between those different instances of training, and then we'd also like to zoom out and identify trends in training pathways across students. So to achieve those goals, we've designed and developed a master student longitudinal construct. And this provides a single source of truth for analysing individual students and their associated demographics and training activity over time. So the first step here is to identify unique students. And here we primarily rely on the unique student identifier, or the USI. The USI has been reported in the TVA data collection since 2015, and it's intended to stay with the student even if they enroll in multiple programs, even if they're moving between different providers, even if they're moving interstate. So this is exactly what we need to be able to trace those learning journeys. Our next challenge is that demographic information submitted for the same student is not always consistent across training records. So on the slide, we have an example looking at activity from 2016 up to 2021. And here we've been able to find some training activity for this student in 2016 and 2017, and then later in 2020 and 2021. As part of this example, let's think about the demographic information that's been reported at these different time points. And let's say that the training records for this student all indicated that she did not have a disability, except for one of her records in 2020. Maybe she had 3 different instances of training in 2020, and just one of those reported that she had a disability. Now, of course, it's possible that this student had a transient disability that coincided with that one instance of training. Another possibility is that this was a data entry error for that one enrollment. So this is just to illustrate some of the complexity of trying to interpret conflicts in student information across the different records that are submitted to NCVER. We know that there are student attributes that can genuinely change over time. We know that data entry errors can occur, and we also know that data can be missing in some cases. So we need to apply some logic here to resolve any of these inconsistencies. What we do is to look at records within each year, and within each year, we'll ignore any missing values, and we'll look at the majority value that's been reported in that particular year. And of course, this is not just for disability status, but across a whole range of demographic attributes. So sex, date of birth, student remoteness, and many others. And by looking at each year separately, we can then also choose whichever time point is most appropriate for our analysis. The next step then is to look at the detail of the enrollment records for each student. So one thing to note is that it's common for programs to be superseded over time. This can occur as they go through accreditation renewal, so the course content may change, and that may result in a new program identifier code. So we need to account for those changes to program codes as we're working through our analysis. We can then look for episodes of training that span multiple consecutive years, and we can group those together as continuous enrollments. So we might find that our students' enrollments in 2016 and 2017 were both in the same program. Let's say she was studying a certificate related to childcare. So we can say that these 2 annual enrollment records belong to one continuous episode of training. We can also look back into the previous year to 2015. And if we don't find that she was training in the same program in 2015, then we can say that she's commenced her training in 2016 and continued in 2017. Moving on to the later activity, let's say that the 2020 and 2021 enrollments were both in a new program. Now let's say she's studying at the diploma level. And we also find that she's changing providers from her 2020 to her 2021 enrollments. So now we have a choice depending on the research question. We could consider these to be one continuing enrollment because the student is studying in the same program across those 2 years. However, if we're interested in looking at transitions between different providers, we could also consider these to be 2 distinct enrollments with that change of provider marking the transition between the 2. Our final step then in collating the data is to see whether we can find completion records for each of these enrollments. So within the TVA data collection, enrollment and completion records sit separately, and we need to go through a process to link them. So we look to see whether we can find a completion record for this student in the same program and at the same provider at a time that makes sense relative to the enrollment records. So in this example, we found one completion record that matches the 2016 to 2017 training. We didn't find a completion record that matches the later enrollments in the diploma level courses. But remember that for this particular example, we're only looking at data up until 2021. So it's possible that this student continued her training in 2022 and we just haven't seen that yet. It's also possible that she has actually completed in 2021, but that completion record hasn't come through in the data collection just yet. So whatever the last time point is in our analysis window, that's always a little ambiguous if we don't find completion records for those last enrollments. So this brings us to the end of the data preparation steps to allow longitudinal analysis. We've looked at how we identify students and make sense of inconsistencies in their demographic information. We've looked at how we can group together enrollment records where training continues across collections. And we've also spoken a little bit about linkage between the program enrollment records and then the corresponding completion records. So now we'll go on to an illustrative example of how we can use this longitudinal data for analysis. And just a reminder that if you have any questions about the data preparation or anything else along the way, just pop those into the Q&A box and we'll come back to them at the end of the presentation. So this case study is taken from recent work on the student journey in VET. This work was actually published on our portal yesterday, so it's brand new. So please do go and have a look at the portal if you'd like to learn more about this research. This particular case study is just one piece out of that research, and it's looking at qualification enrollments to examine how students progressed between levels of education throughout their VET journey. And as was the case for the examples that we've looked at so far, we're looking at activity between 2016 up to 2021. So here we're not looking at enrollments in accredited short courses or skill sets or those standalone subjects that I mentioned. We're just focusing in on enrollments in qualifications, and then we'll look at the transitions between episodes of training and qualifications. For this analysis, we first need to understand how many students commenced a qualification in 2016. And then we can look at what proportion of those students went on to enroll in a subsequent qualification. We can then break that down to look at the proportion who went on to something at a higher level versus a lower level of education. We can look at whether the transitions look different for students who completed their initial qualification versus those who didn't complete. And we can also start to unpack some of the most popular combinations of qualifications that students undertook within this particular analysis window. So here are the results. In the analysis, we found that 1.4 million students commenced a VET qualification in 2016. Most of these students did not go on to commence a subsequent qualification up to 2021. So that's the 62.3% shown in the grey bar. Around a third did go on to enroll in another qualification though. And for most of those students who went on to something else, we were able to identify whether that transition was to a higher level of education, lower level education, or staying at the same level. That's the proportion shown in green. We did have a small proportion, the 5.2% shown in black. These students enrolled in multiple qualifications at multiple different levels of education within the same year. And so we weren't really able to determine whether that movement was to a higher level or lower level just because of that mixed level of education that they were studying. So the case study analysis that we're talking about now was focusing in on that green group where we were able to track the direction of movement. What we see here is that less than half of students who went on to another enrollment went on to something at a higher level. So that's the purple bar, 41.3%. Most students were either staying at the same level or going on to something at a lower level. But of course, as I've already hinted at, you could imagine that the pathways might look a bit different for students who completed that initial qualification versus the students who didn't complete their initial qualification. So here we're now looking at pathways for completers versus pathways for non-completers. we can see that when we look at the completers compared to the overall results, there's a much clearer trend towards movement to a higher level of education. Whereas if we look at the last panel, which is showing those non-completers of that initial 2016 commencing enrollment, we can see that still around a third are going on to a higher level of education, but it's much lower than for the completers. We see about 30% went on to something at a lower level of education in light blue. And now we have a higher proportion of students who are staying at the same level as their first qualification that they didn't complete. So really quite distinct patterns here for completers versus non-completers. And the final snippet that I'll show you now are some examples of the popular combinations of training that students undertook within these pathways. So in the top 3 rows, we're looking at the most popular pathways for students who completed their initial enrollment and then went on to something at a higher level of education. So here we see that the most popular pathway is from a Certificate 3 in Early Childhood Education and Care, moving on to a Diploma of Early Childhood Education and Care. And we also see popular pathways from carpentry to building and construction, and from individual support to aging support. So overall, what we're seeing is that there's a lot of alignment between the first commencing enrollment and then the subsequent enrollment for these completers moving on to a higher level. The bottom 3 rows are then looking at the most popular combinations for non-completers who then went to something at a lower level. So here we're seeing the same pathway in early childhood education and care, but now it's in reverse. So students who are not completing the diploma level are then going to enroll in the Certificate 3 instead. And the other pathways here also show that alignment between the first and the subsequent qualification that students are undertaking. So there's a lot more detail around this analysis in the research that I mentioned before. So if you're interested, please do go and have a look at that on the NCVER portal. Okay, I'll pass back to Melinda now.
Thanks, Michelle. So the longitudinal student view that Michelle has just demonstrated allows us to track student pathways within total VET activity. However, in order to examine the pre and post VET pathways and outcomes for apprentices and trainees specifically, we need to link the total VET activity data to the National Apprentice and Trainee Collection. So this next section of the webinar steps through how we've linked these data sets, and I'll also provide an example of a current project that explores the linked data sets to understand apprentice and trainee VET pathways and outcomes. As the unique student identifier that Michelle mentioned is actually not available on all apprentice and trainee contracts, the total VET activity data and national apprentice and trainee data are linked using common variables that exist between both data sets. Once we've linked the 2 data sets, we can add the USI to all matched apprentice and trainee contracts. And in doing this, we end up with around 80% of apprentice and trainee contracts with a USI. And then using the USI, we can then explore the VET pathways and outcomes for apprentices and trainees, both prior to commencing their apprenticeship or traineeship and post-commencement or completion. So NCVER is currently working on a project that explores the linked data sets to assess the value of pre-apprenticeships in delivering improved apprenticeship outcomes, such as an apprenticeship completion and also retention in the apprenticeship. So the figure in this slide illustrates the potential VET pathways for pre-apprenticeship students. As you can see, the pathway can be quite varied, with some pre-apprenticeship students commencing apprenticeships without ever having completed their pre-apprenticeship, and others complete the pre-apprenticeship but go on to other VET rather than an apprenticeship, and some actually leave the sector altogether. Those that do go on to an apprenticeship may go on to either a trade or non-trade apprenticeship. In our evaluation for this study, we're looking at a series of outcomes along this pre-apprenticeship student journey. The first thing we'll be examining is the proportion of pre-apprenticeship students who complete a pre-apprenticeship. We're then going to determine the proportion who go on to commence an apprenticeship, including both trade and non-trade. And we'll be looking at the proportion of pre-apprenticeship students who go on to other VET instead of an apprenticeship, and the proportion who leave the sector altogether during the period of our analysis. We'll be undertaking analysis to see if pre-apprenticeship students are more likely than non-pre-apprenticeship students to complete an apprenticeship or to stay in an apprenticeship for longer. Our results from this study, which includes a lot of other quantitative analysis and also a qualitative component, will be published in mid-2025 on NCVER's portal. Moving on to the next section of the webinar, here I'm going to be talking about how we can use the ABS person-level integrated data asset, or PLIDA, to investigate student outcomes beyond VET to other outcomes such as employment and occupation. I'm also going to be sharing how NCVER has used PLIDA to assess sustainable employment outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students. PLIDA is a secure data asset combining information on health, education, government payments, income and taxation, population demographics, and employment over time. It can provide us with insights about various VET student and training cohorts, their characteristics and associated enrolments in education and training, as well as their education, employment and occupation outcomes. Data from many government and government-related agencies, such as NCVER, supply data to the ABS for linkage. The ABS has created a person-level data linkage spine based on the combined population from Services Australia Medicare data, the Department of Social Services Centrelink data, and Australian Taxation Office personal income tax data. This person-level spine is then used by approved data analysts such as us on a project-by-project basis to link in additional data sets within the PLIDA environment for analysis. As there are many data sources contained within PLIDA, the first step when using the integrated data asset is to determine the data that is to be included in the analysis and therefore linked to the person-level spine. And to do this, we need to think about several things. Firstly, we need to consider the activity that we're wanting to explore. For example, do we want to explore pathways and outcomes for VET students only, or do we want to explore VET pathways and outcomes to higher education pathways and outcomes? If we want to compare both of these, we'll need to link in both VET and higher education data to the person-level spine. We may also want to consider if there are specific cohorts of interest that we want to analyse, and these may be student or training characteristics. For example, we might be interested in examining outcomes for students who commence a particular qualification, or maybe a group of qualifications, or outcomes for students who belong to a particular equity group. Once we've considered our cohorts of interest, we need to think about the outcomes that we want to assess for these selected cohorts. Outcomes can include things like program or subject completion, or labour force outcomes such as employment status, income, occupation, or industry of employment. And finally, consideration needs to be given to the time period included in the analysis. If we're wanting to allow commencing students enough time to complete their training before assessing employment outcomes, we need to ensure enough data is available for analysis. Secondly, different data sources have different collection periods. For example, VET data is collected annually, whereas ATO data is collected every financial year. We need to take these differences into account and marry up the data in the best way possible to examine the pre- and post-training outcomes for students. So once we've determined the data to include in the analysis, we need to link the data sets using the PLIDA person-level spine. And this allows records of the same person from different data sets to be joined together. By way of example, let's imagine we've decided to compare occupation outcomes for VET program completers in 2016 who were born in Australia with occupation outcomes for VET program completers in 2016 who were born outside of Australia. Maybe we want to see if there's a difference in the occupations in which these student cohorts gained employment post their training. So to conduct this analysis, we'd need to link the following data sets with the PLIDA person-level spine. Demographic data from the ABS 2016 census to obtain data on a student's country of birth, program completions data from NCVER to obtain VET program completions in 2016, and personal income tax data from the ATO to obtain the ANSCO code for the student's occupation of employment post-training. So now our data sets are finally all linked, we can actually start our analysis. And it's at this stage that we might want to determine the different time periods that we include in our analysis. For example, we might want to compare the occupation outcomes for students who completed a VET qualification to those who did not complete a VET qualification. And in this instance, we would need enough VET data and ATO data to allow the student time to complete the qualification and then gain subsequent employment. We also need to consider the most appropriate statistical method to use for our analysis. Whilst comparative analysis that compares outcomes among different student cohorts can be informative, it is limited in its ability to isolate, for example, the potential effect of a VET completion on a student's occupation outcome. And for this reason, we might decide to use a common statistical method such as logistic regression to help us understand the impact of completing a qualification on a student's occupation outcome. And using this approach, we could construct treatment and control groups, where the treatment group is the group who completed the VET qualification, while the control group did not complete a VET qualification. The treatment and control groups can then be matched to contain individuals with similar demographic characteristics, with only differences being that one group has completed the VET qualification and the other group has not. And using our agreed approach, we can now conduct our analysis and examine the difference in post-training outcomes between the treatment and control groups to determine if a VET qualification completion has an impact on the student's post-training occupation outcome. In this next section, I'm going to be sharing how NCVER explored PLIDA to evaluate sustainable employment outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students. This example will cover several of the considerations that I have just discussed in the previous slides. I'm going to be talking through some methodological detail, and some of the results may seem quite technical for non-data people, so please bear with me while I go through these. The full report for this analysis was published in October 2023 and can be accessed from the NCVER portal. So in this analysis, Indigenous student outcomes were compared for completers of a VET program, non-completers and non-commencers. So that's students that did not enrol in any VET program in the analysis period. The analysis linked NCVER total VET activity data for VET program enrolments and completions, ABS 2016 census data for demographic information on individuals, and Department of Social Services domino benefit data for data relating to the receipt of unemployment benefits. And this was used as the main measure for someone who was not employed pre and post training. The time period for this analysis spanned nearly 6 years, with 4 years of VET data and 18 months of ATO data used in the analysis. Both program completers and non-completers had a pre-training period of 1 year. This was to ensure there was no program enrolment seen in 2015, so that we could confirm that the program commenced in 2016. And this is illustrated in green in the figure in the slide. The period for a VET program completion and a non-completion included data from 2016 to 2018, allowing sufficient time for students to complete the program, and noting over 90% of commencing students complete a qualification within 2 years. The post-training period took into consideration the potential time required to find a job after completing their training. For this analysis, we used logistic regression to assess the impact of completing a VET program on a student's employment outcome, with treatment and control groups created to compare the difference in outcomes for VET completers, non-completers, and non-commencers. And by examining the difference in outcomes between the groups before and after training, we were able to isolate the effect of VET. The figure presented in this slide shows the odds ratios estimated by logistic regression. The odds ratio represents the likelihood that an outcome will occur when given a particular treatment. In this example, it's commencing a VET program. whilst holding all other factors constant. An odds ratio greater than 1 indicates an increased likelihood of achieving sustainable employment, by comparison with those in the baseline group shown here in green. Conversely, an odds ratio lower than 1 suggests a decreased likelihood of achieving the outcome. One of the key findings from this study was that participating in VET increased the likelihood of sustainable employment for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. The analysis showed that the likelihood of achieving sustainable employment was about 20% higher for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who had commenced at least one VET program in 2016, compared with those who had not commenced a VET program during the same year. Interestingly, the outcomes were similar irrespective of whether the student had completed or not completed the VET programs that they had commenced in 2016. A regression model was fitted to the data to estimate the effect of different student and training characteristics on the likelihood of achieving a sustainable employment outcome. The table presented here shows these factors ranked by order of influence, showing the degree of disadvantage endured by students exercise the most influence, with state of residence the least. What I presented here is just a snippet of this research study, and I encourage you all to have a closer look at the findings within the final report. I'm now going to pass back to Michelle to take you through the final section of today's webinar before wrapping up for questions and discussion.
Thanks, Mel. So for the final section of the webinar today, we'll cover a little bit about technology tools. So moving away from sort of results and particular analysis that we've run and just talking about the technology that supports them. As we've shown in the presentation so far, we've really been expanding the scale of our data and analysis work at NCVER. So we've been expanding our data linkage, we've been working with bigger data sets and also pursuing more complex analysis and modelling. And all of this work requires powerful computing resources for storage and for processing. So some of the examples that we've touched on, such as those using PLIDA data, are relying on external computing resources, such as those available in the ABS Data Lab environment. But we've also been expanding our resources at NCVER, and I'll take you through a little bit of that now. So one key example is that NCVER have partnered with Deloitte to build a cloud-based analytics platform based on Azure and Databricks to support in-house analytics projects. The platform gives us access to on-demand scalable computing resources. We have the flexibility to draw on a range of programming languages. So SQL and Python are the main ones that we use in-house, but we can also draw on R and Scala if they offer features that we can't access through those primary tools. We can also access open source code libraries, and we can integrate code management tools such as Git to ensure that our work is replicable and well documented. And we also have the ability to connect to a range of visualization tools to present outputs such as Click. So what can we do with the analytics platform? I'm not going to go into a lot of technical detail here, just would like to provide one example of the type of analytics that we can undertake using this new platform. And that is that we've used the platform to develop machine learning models for estimating completion rates for VET qualifications and also to estimate completion rates for apprentice and trainee contracts of training. So essentially what we've been doing in this work is training machine learning models to identify patterns between the characteristics of the student, the provider and the training on the one hand, and then the outcome of the training on the other hand, so whether it was completed or not. Once we've trained a model, we can then use that model to make predictions for new commencing students or new enrolments. So again, the model will look at the characteristics of the student, provider and training, and it will make predictions on the likelihood of completion based on what it's learned from those earlier examples that we trained the model on. So this has been extensive exploratory work where we've been assessing the potential to improve on the current methodologies that we use to predict completion rates. One of the key benefits that we're working towards is improving the timeliness of those predicted completion rates for new commencing cohorts. So we'd really like to be able to make those predictions as soon as we have data on the new students who are commencing. For those who do know a little bit about machine learning and are interested in some of the technical detail, we've been using gradient boosting algorithms implemented with the open source library scikit-learn, which is a very popular open source library. And it's really the tooling that's available through this new analytics platform that's allowed us to use those code libraries and to access the computing resources that we need to undertake that work. We do have a technical paper available on the NCVER portal that goes into more detail if you're interested in this aspect of our work. I'll hand back to Melinda.
Thanks, Michelle. And that brings us to the end of the various sections within our webinar. But before we wrap up the questions, I would just like to briefly discuss the NCVER services that are available to you on request. We offer a consultancy service across a wide range of expertise, including both quantitative and qualitative research. And today we've shown you just some examples of the type of bespoke quantitative analysis that we can undertake using our longitudinal student construct, as well as ABS PLIDA, to support the vet sector in understanding vet students and their pathways and outcomes both within and also outside of vet. We can also tailor studies to include both quantitative and or qualitative research to address your research needs. These can be designed to include extensive literature reviews, one-on-one interviews or focus groups, surveys, and also stakeholder consultations. And you can also contact us via our portal to request data from any of our many statistical collections. Just a reminder to please join NCVER at our annual National Vet Conference in Perth from the 10th to the 12th of July this year. And for further details on the conference and how to register for the event, please visit our portal. For any follow-up inquiries from today's presentation, you can contact myself or Michelle Hall on the emails shown here. So that brings us to the end of our presentation today, and we'd like to thank you for your time today in joining our webinar, and would like to now open up to any questions.
So we do have a couple of questions coming through about the longitudinal construct from the beginning of the presentation. One is whether the data in the construct will be kept up to date over time, and that's absolutely our intention. As we get annual data coming through, we will be refreshing the data construct to build out that timeline that's available for analysis. Another question about the construct is to do with missing values. So we spoke about within each particular year, we would be looking at ignoring the missing values and looking for the most common value. And the question is whether we would replace missing values with the most common value. So what we're doing is within each year, we're looking for that most common value that's reported, and then that will be taken as the source of truth or the true value for that particular student. And then we end up with this student level set of demographics. So we're not necessarily replacing any missing values with the most common value. We're just coming up with this sort of student level set of demographics. It's very rare that we would have missing values across all records for that student where we wouldn't have a most common value coming through. So hope that answers that question.
There's another question here that I can answer in relation to access to PLIDA. So best to understand how to access PLIDA and who can access it is probably best to go on to the ABS website. There's a wealth of information on there about PLIDA and how you can obtain access to it.
Another question about PLIDA was to do with the ATO and vet data. Are they once per year, just at different times? So that's right. The collection period differs for the vet data and the ATO data assets. So the vet data is an annual collection that's based on calendar year. So we get all of the enrollment activity from January to December for each calendar year. And then the ATO data sets, for example, the personal income tax data is available on a calendar year, a financial year basis. So they're just slightly misaligned, and we just need to take that into account for the various pieces of analysis.
So I think in practical terms for that, if we were looking at somebody, their final employment in a particular financial year, we would need, and we're wanting to understand what training they undertook prior to moving into that occupation. We would need to consider the fact that training could have occurred in the first half of the financial year before going into employment. And so we could look at our total vet activity data and look at start and end dates for the first 6 months of the year. So we capture that pre-training before employment, instead of just looking at the previous calendar year for the total vet activity and missing out on that 6 months before the ATO data. So it's little things like that we need to consider when we're setting up these projects to make sure that we are marrying up the data in the best way for the analysis. Question around is the session is being recorded, and you can watch it from our portal. So there'll be a link posted to the NCVER portal or website, and you'll be able to access the link there to review it in your own time, and anyone can access that link from our portal.
Take a question: is the predictive analysis machine learning model available for others to use? At this stage, we're still working through that experimental process of refining the models and testing them on data that we have available. So it's not in a form that would be available for others to use at this stage, but we'll be reviewing that in the future.
Another question here about, have we included any analysis progressing to higher education post-vet? At this stage, we haven't looked at higher education, but it is certainly something that we can link in higher education data within the PLIDA environment and look at that progression to higher education, and also make those comparisons between the two sectors. We're just reviewing some of the questions coming through. If we don't get to answer your question here, we will certainly try and follow up via email. So contact details slide will be available in the link. But I think you may be able to see that slide currently. I think the question actually was in relation to some of the consultancy activities that we can provide, that will be available in the link with the full slide deck.
There's a question: is the data delimited to any particular study courses, occupation pathways, or is it inclusive of all? I'm wondering if that refers back to the case study analysis that I spoke about at the beginning of the presentation. So that was across all qualifications, and it's national data as well. But we would have the option to break that down to particular pathways. If we wanted to, we could filter down to particular courses that students are studying, or filter the data in other ways as well. Question about whether we can look at how many people are doing higher education qual and then going back to vet. So rather than looking at movement from vocational education to higher education, looking in the reverse direction, that would be something that we would need to look to the PLIDA data to be able to do that type of analysis, to have access to both vet and higher ed pathways. But certainly we could look in both directions, assuming that there's enough of a time series to be able to look at those transitions.
I've got a question here about other webinars that we'll be running. NCVER does have a series of webinars that it will run throughout the year, and you can certainly go to our portal page to see what is upcoming in regards to that. They normally will follow releases of research that we're putting out. It's just recently been published, so please have a look on the portal and see what's coming up to register for anything in the future.
Had quite a lot of questions coming through, so apologies if we've missed yours. We're sort of looking to see what we can answer here. It's a question, what's the level of disaggregation that data in the construct can be reported at? And the example given is, can we report occupation data? So within the longitudinal construct that's looking just within the total vet activity data, we can see things like the intended occupational outcome for particular courses. We can see which programs students are doing. We can see things like the type of provider, the funding source. So if you're familiar with the kinds of variables that we have available through NCVER's data builder, those are the sorts of things that we can look at. Depending on what kind of disaggregations we might be interested in, we can run into issues of sample size. So that's usually the limiting factor. Question, will the construct be made publicly available for researchers to access? So in the current form, the longitudinal construct is accessing unit record level data. So we have individual rows within the data set for students and for different enrollments. And so that has significant implications for privacy if we were to make that data publicly available. So for now, we can do custom analysis on a consultancy basis, as Melinda has mentioned, and in the future we can review whether there are possibly aggregate data that might be possible to make available publicly.
Okay, I think by the looks of things, we have covered most of the question. There's probably a couple there that just warrant an email directly to individuals. So I think at this point we will wrap up the questions. As I mentioned, the recording from today's webinar will be shared on NCVER's portal. A short online evaluation survey will be sent by email, and we would appreciate it if you could take the time to provide feedback, as this will help us improve your experience next time. I'd really like to thank everyone for participating in today's webinar, including Michelle and the NCVER team who organised the event. And remember to please stay connected with us through social media and our website at www.ncver.edu.au. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.